Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Service Institute's Mabini Dialogue. My name is Jeremy, and I will be your moderator for this event. In this Mabini Dialogue, we will examine the renewed great power competition and why democracies dominate. The notion that states with representative forms of government can accumulate power more effectively than unrepresented regimes is an enduring one. Many political theories, mainly from the West, have held states ruled by democratic institutions perform better in long-run political competitions, and contemporary social science research concurs. In other words, democracies enjoy a built-in advantage in the struggle for global mastery. The empirical evidence supports this hunch. According to international relations theories, the leading state in the international system for the past 400 years has always been among its most democratic. And it's kind of hard to argue against an undefeated record for over 4 centuries. For this afternoon, we are honored to have Dr. Matthew Koenig, who is an associate professor in the Department of Government and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is also a senior fellow in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. He has held positions as senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Harvard University, Stanford University, and the University of California. His work has covered a wide range of topics in international relations and national security. He is also an author or editor of 6 books, including the forthcoming The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. His articles have appeared in many publications, including American Political Science Review, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, International Organization, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Dr. Koenig holds an MA and PhD in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley. Currently, he lives in Washington with his wife and his beautiful daughter. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a generous welcome to our speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in Manila, in the Philippines, at the Foreign Services Institute. This is my first time in the Philippines. I got in yesterday and spent a great day in the Intramuros. It rained on me a little bit, but otherwise an enjoyable walk around town. And then I went down to the Manila Bay and I saw maybe the most beautiful sunset in my life. I don't know if you remember yesterday, but it was orange and purple and just fantastic. And of course, the Philippines is a long-standing, decades-long ally of the United States, so it's really a pleasure to be here among friends. So the talk I want to give today is about what many see as a new competition between great powers in international politics. Of special interest here in Asia is the competition between the United States and China. And what I'm going to argue today is that the United States, despite these challenges from China, Russia, and elsewhere, will continue to be the leading state in international politics for one simple reason. Democracies do better in these long-term competitions. So America's institutions are the key in its competitive struggle with China and other states. So first, I want to start by talking about the US-led international order. You know, after World War II, the United States was left as the most powerful state in the international system. And this isn't a position that the United States sought, but rather it was kind of happened by accident. The other major powers in the world had destroyed themselves in World War I and World War II, and the United States was left standing as the most dominant state in the world. You know, over half of world GDP, according to some measures, was in the United States. After World War II, it was the largest military power. It was left with forces stationed in Europe and in Asia. But rather than use that power for domination, the United States did something that was really kind of unprecedented. It set up the international system that we know today. It tried to set up a rules-based rather than use that power for domination, it set up the international system that we know today. It set up the United Nations, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the World Trade Organization, institutions to govern a rules-based international order. It promoted free trade and economic development. And it promoted democratic institutions, especially where it had influence in Europe and in Asia. And I think the result has been the world that we see today. For the past 70 years, we've had a complete absence of great power war, very different from the international politics before 1945, where we had World War I, World War II, the Napoleonic Wars. Also, levels of economic development, much higher today than prior to World War II. And freedom, more people around the world living under democratic institutions than at any time in world history. But some fear that this system, this US-led international rules-based system, is under attack. So we see it under attack in Europe, Russia using military force to redraw the map of Europe, really for the first time since World War II. In the Middle East, the existence of a terrorist state, ISIS, that controls territory in Iraq and Syria. And in Asia, China becoming more aggressive, taking territory from US treaty allies through military coercion. And the China challenge seems particularly severe to some. The Chinese economy since the 1970s has been growing at really a rapid pace, 10% per year up until recently. And as you all know, China has been using some of that economic power and translating it into military power. Really rapid military buildup that is contesting, changing the balance of power, and really contesting the US ability to provide security to traditional partners such as Taiwan. And arguably, China is engaging in elements to increase its diplomatic power as well and to rewrite the rules of the international system. So creating new institutions like the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank that route around, to some degree, these Washington-based institutions like the World Bank. And so many people are asking, is the US-led era of international politics over? Will some of these other challengers, will China overtake the United States as the leading state in the international system? And if so, what does a Chinese-led international system look like? Will it be like the US-led system, or will it be very different? And given that China is ruled by a different set of domestic political institutions, not a democracy, I think there's good reason to believe that the type of system China would want to set up globally would be different from the US-led system. So I'm working on a book now looking at these issues. I wrote an article recently that I think some of you have read where I question this narrative. And I argue that in fact, despite the growth of Chinese power, that the United States has a number of built-in advantages, basically in its institutions, and that we've seen through political science theory, but also through evidence historically, that democracies do better in these long-run competitions. And for this reason, there's every reason to believe that the United States will remain the leading state in the international system and in Asia, that the United States and its democratic allies will continue to flourish, and that we don't have to worry about China taking over and changing the system. So why do I make this argument? Well, the first point to look at is that there's a long tradition of thinking that democracies do better in these long-run international competitions. So Machiavelli, Montesquieu, Livius, some kind of classic political theorists in the West have written about these democratic systems. And they look to the Roman Empire in particular as an example. And they asked a simple question: how did Rome, which started out as this small city-state on the Italian peninsula, how did Rome then come to conquer what at the time was the known world, the entire Mediterranean world? And their answer was quite simple. It was Rome's republican institutions that allowed it to rise to greatness. And then once the institutions changed, once Rome became an empire, that started to sow the seeds of decay and the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire. And their argument was quite simple. Machiavelli, the Italian political theorist, made the argument quite clearly. And in fact, a little bit of a side note, I was in Italy last month teaching a 2-week course on Machiavelli. So we got to go to Machiavelli's house. We went to see the desk where he wrote The Prince. So maybe some of you can consider taking this course at some point if you'd like to come to Italy. But Machiavelli's argument was quite simple. He said that when a city is ruled by a prince, by a dictator, the prince does what's in his own interest, and often that means it's not what's in the common interest. Where, on the other hand, when you have a republican system, where the people rule, the people look out for their own self-interest, but their own self-interest represents a broader array of society, and for that reason, it leads to kind of greater strength and greater power. And Machiavelli said, when the prince does what's in his own interest, it's often against the interest of society as a whole, whereas when society as a whole is ruling, it's good for the growth of power of the state. And so Machiavelli may be best known for his writing in The Prince about autocratic rule, but he clearly says elsewhere in his writing that the wise prince will use his power to set up a republican system of government for his everlasting glory. So this is one ancient view of looking at democracies and international power. But if you look at contemporary political science research and economics research, there's also a lot of reason to believe that democracies do better. I'm a professor of political science at Georgetown University. I teach the PhD seminar on advanced international relations theory. And basically the past decade or so of research in political science has kind of obsessed over democracies versus autocracies and how they might be different in international political behavior. And basically the finding over and over again is that democracies do it better. So the first area that scholars have looked at is economic growth. And do democracies have higher long-run rates of economic growth? Some scholars, James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu at MIT, have looked at this question. And they've found that democracies do have higher long-run rates of economic growth. And their arguments are pretty similar to the arguments that Machiavelli made 500 years ago. And they said that in order to have high long-run rates of economic growth, you need inclusive economic institutions. You need economic institutions that allow the participation in the economy of a broad sector of society. And the reason why that contributes to economic growth, they argue, is pretty straightforward. If you have economic institutions that systematically exclude people from the economy, that you're not going to have as dynamic an economy as an economy that's more inclusive, that includes a broader section of society. Moreover, Robinson and Acemoglu argue that political institutions are key to economic institutions. That if you have exclusive political institutions that exclude large segments of society from politics, then you'll often have exclusive economic institutions that also exclude people from society. Where on the other hand, if you have broad political institutions, you have broad economic institutions, and this is better for growth. Now at this point, some people might be saying, well, it seems like there are exceptions to this. What about countries like China that have had high long-run rates of economic growth, despite the fact that they're autocracies? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. But basically, Robinson and Acemoglu argue that it can't last. That countries that have more exclusive political institutions can have high rates of economic growth in the relatively short term, but eventually they run out of steam. A second area that scholars have looked at is international finance. And why do financial markets flourish in some countries but not others? Why has New York been the center of the international financial world for the past 100 years? Why was it London before that? Although London still does pretty well. And again, they argue that political institutions matter and that democracies do better. So one concrete example is when it comes to sovereign debt. Countries around the world issue debt as a way to raise money. The United States issues U.S. Treasury bonds, sells U.S. Treasury bonds as a way to finance its debt. And scholars who have looked at this, Kenneth Schultz, a political scientist at Stanford, and others, have argued that if you're an investor and you're thinking about buying stocks or buying a Treasury bond, On average, would you prefer to buy the bond from a democratic government or from an autocratic government? And they argue that investors prefer putting their money in democratic countries. And the reason they argue is that autocratic countries, if you have kind of a dictator or a single decision maker, can easily default on their debt, can easily decide not to repay these loans. But in democracies, the promises to repay loans are much more credible on average. Because they argue there are checks and balances, that Congress can prevent a president from defaulting on loans. Investors within the country that might be influential political players themselves have an incentive to prevent the executive from defaulting on the loans. And so on average, they make a pretty compelling case that throughout history, financial markets have done better in open societies, that investors feel more comfortable investing in democratic societies. A third area that scholars have looked at over the past decade or so is alliances. And they've asked, do democracies make better allies or do autocracies make better allies? And what they found is that democracies, on average, have more alliance partners, and democracies, on average, are more likely to actually fulfill the obligations of their alliance when those alliances are tested. If an ally is attacked, is a democracy more likely to come to an ally's defense, or is an autocracy? And again, they argue that democracies are more credible when they make these commitments. That for a democratic leader, it would be difficult to sign an alliance with another country and then to back down, because it would have to worry about domestic political opinion, about elections, about being criticized from the opposition. Whereas for autocracies, it's much easier to sign an alliance and back down. You don't have to worry about being voted out of office. You don't have to worry about your public opinion because you have firmer control. So a good example they give is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact before World War II. Hitler signed this pact with Stalin, a non-aggression pact. But of course, as soon as it was in Stalin's interest to do so, he turned around and invaded the Soviet Union. On the other hand, they pointed out that alliances among democracies, like the NATO alliance, tends to be longer lasting, include more members, and members actually live up to their obligations. A fourth and final area is international conflict. So you're probably all familiar with the democratic peace idea, that democracies don't fight other democracies, but we have seen that democracies fight autocracies, and autocracies fight each other. So this is one of the strongest findings in political science. Some political scientists say it's the closest thing we have to a law in political science. But not only do we find that democracies are less likely to go to war with one another, there's also quite a bit of evidence that democracies are more likely to win the wars that they fight. That democracies are actually more effective in warfare. So since 1815, political scientists have collected data on every war from 1815 to the present. Since 1815, democracies have won, I believe, 70% of the wars that they've fought. And I don't have the data handy, but it's in the article. I think autocracies have won something like 40% of the wars that they've fought. So the record for democracies is much better. So why might this be the case? Well, the scholars that have looked at this propose a couple of reasons. One, they say democracies are more careful to select wars that they can actually win. Democracies are good at avoiding stupid wars. Because if you're a democratic leader, there's no better way to be voted out of office, no better way for your party to lose popularity than losing in international conflict. So you want to be very careful that if you're going to get into a war, you're going to win. On the other hand, if you're an autocracy, if you're Kim Jong-un in North Korea, if you get into a conflict and have to back down or lose, you don't have to be worried about being voted out of office. So as examples, here the scholars look at the Japanese decision to attack the United States in Pearl Harbor in World War II. An example of an autocracy choosing a dumb war in some ways, an autocracy picking a war with the United States that it ultimately lost. On the other hand, democracies choosing only wars that they can win. A lot of good examples, I think, from history, but one good example is the United States in the 1991 Gulf War, where the United States built an overwhelming coalition and pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and won decisively. So far all this research has kind of focused on these individual areas. Democracies have higher long-run rates of economic growth. They're better at raising debt and forming international financial markets. They're better at forming international alliances and actually live up to the terms of those alliances. They avoid wars, but they win the wars that they fight. And so if we aggregate all of this up into a bigger theory of international political competition, then I think there's good reason to believe that democracies do better. If we're looking at a competition between the United States and China, or between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or between the United States and its Western allies against Nazi Germany in World War II, if democracies have higher long-run rates of economic growth, they build better financial markets so they can raise debt when times get tough due to financial crises or international conflict. They have large alliance systems, and those alliances are actually reliable. They avoid conflicts, but when they get into conflicts, they win. Then I think there's good reason to believe that democracies should be better positioned for these long-term international political competitions. And indeed, if we look historically, I think there's a lot of evidence to support this idea. As was pointed out in the introduction, what have been the leading states in the international system for the past several hundred years? Well, according to most analysts and scholars, the United States has been the leading state in the international system since 1945, so for the past 70 years. Before that, going back to the 1700s or so, many people would argue that Great Britain was the leading state in the international system. So the British Empire might not qualify as a democracy according to contemporary standards, but it was the most open state in the international system in its time. And before that, many people looked to the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic, which was a commercial power, had colonies around the world, as the leading state in the international system since in the 1600s. So arguably we have a 500-year history of the leading state in the international system being a democracy. On the other hand, if you look at some of the autocratic challengers, again, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, they were considerable challengers, posed a considerable challenge, but in the end they flailed out. Napoleon might be another example, Napoleon's France. Posed considerable challenges, but in the end it wasn't durable. So not only do we have these prominent qualitative case studies, but I've also done some quantitative analysis. So I don't know in political science in the Philippines if this kind of quantitative revolution has caught on, but in the United States, political scientists, more and more like economists, are also doing statistical analyses. And I've done some statistical analyses looking at this issue and have found a pretty strong relationship that democratic countries over time tend to become more powerful on average, controlling for other things that might matter. And autocracies on average tend to do less well, tend to be less adept at accumulating power over time. So in sum, I think, trying to generalize as a political scientist, as a social scientist, I think there's good reason to believe that democracies have a built-in advantage in these kind of international competitions. Now this may seem counterintuitive to some because often we hear the argument, well, autocracies can be decisive. Autocratic leader can decide to embark on a certain course of action, maybe a major infrastructure project, and can push ahead. Whereas democracies, everything is so slow, they have to debate, it takes forever to get anything done. But I think what this perspective would suggest is that actually, precisely for those reasons, precisely because of those constraints, democracies do better. When they make a commitment, they mean it. There's actually been societal buy-in. They're going to live up to that commitment. And if they make some major decision, it has, it's going to move forward, and it's going to be a well-considered idea. Whereas autocracies might be able to move fast, but are more likely to also make big mistakes. And this is, again, an argument that goes all the way back to Polybius and others in the ancient world. Okay, so maybe that relationship exists on average. What does it mean, though, today for the competition the United States faces between Russia, and in particular, since we're in Asia, with China? But what it would suggest is that, on average, the United States should have higher long-run rates of economic growth, should be better at forming international capital and financial markets, should have stronger and more reliable allies, should be less likely to get into dumb wars, and should be more likely to win wars that it enters. So what does the evidence look like if we look at the United States and China? Well, first, economic growth. So as I pointed out, China's economy has been growing like gangbusters since the 1970s, 10% a year until recently. But that's been slowing down. 7%, 6%, and some suspect that the Chinese government may be shading these numbers a little bit. That 7 or 6% may even be a little bit higher than the true number. If we look at GDP, the United States, depending on what data you look at, still has roughly a quarter of world GDP. Somewhere between 20 and 25% of wealth in the world is, of economic activity in the world is in the United States. China is growing, but it's still only 13, 14, 15%. So the US economy is still much larger than China's. If you project numbers forward, you can get to projections where China will overtake the United States as the largest economy on Earth sometime in the 2020s. But that does depend a lot on the current trajectories sustaining themselves. And as I pointed out, the Chinese economy has been slowing. Moreover, many economists have argued that in order for China to continue to grow, in order for China to break out of the so-called middle income trap, that it will have to push through some much-needed economic reforms. But these economic reforms have been slow in the making. And many analysts point out that it will be difficult for China to actually push through these economic reforms without potentially undermining control of the Chinese Communist Party. And so will the Chinese Communist Party be willing to give up political power that might be necessary for these economic reforms? So Robinson and Acemoglu and other economists who've looked at this have said the Chinese model of growth has basically been sustained by moving resources from unproductive sectors of the economy, basically from taking labor from agriculture, and moving them to more productive sectors, moving them into manufacturing, and that has led to this sustained growth. But that model has run its course, and that if China is going to break out of the middle income trap, it'll have to also engage in innovation in order to become an advanced industrial economy. And there are real questions whether China will be able to do that. Second, what about the international financial situation? New York remains the center of the international financial world. Whenever times get difficult and investors really want to put their money in a safe investment, they buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Contrary-wise, there isn't an advanced financial market in China. China does have a stock market, but there are a lot of restrictions on currency convertibility, other things that make it very difficult for investors to access the Chinese market. And so there too, the Chinese leadership have recognized this as a problem. That they see that they need to make some economic reforms here if they want China to really become a center of the international financial world. So they've recognized the problem, but so far they've been unwilling to make the changes. And again, many analysts question whether they'll be willing to make changes to their financial system. Again, because it could undermine the control of the party, something that the United States, with a more open economic and political system, doesn't have to worry about. Third, the alliance system. The U.S. alliance system, I think, is one of the greatest sources of its strength. The United States has over 30 formal allies, 27 members of NATO, in Asia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, Thailand. So these are some of the best governed democratic countries on Earth, some of the wealthiest countries on Earth. Combined, the United States and its allies have over 50% of world GDP. So this is a great source of strength, and the United States and its partners have been able to work together on many important international security issues. The counterterrorism cooperation going on in the south of the Philippines right now is only one of the most recent important examples. China, on the other hand, doesn't have a network of international friends and partners. China, it's unclear. China may have one ally,
The kind of terms of the agreement are unclear, and that one ally is North Korea, an economic basket case, engaging in provocative behaviors that Beijing is increasingly frustrated with. So when you have friends like that, who needs enemies? Now the Chinese government have said, well, we're explicitly avoiding forming alliances internationally because we're afraid, that this leads the United States to make too many commitments and it's more of a burden. So we don't want allies like the United States has. We see that as a burden. But if the United States really wants to become a leading state in Asia, a leading state in the international system, it needs friends and partners. You need friends and partners to do much in the international system. And so far, China hasn't been able to build those kind of alliances. And I think there are real questions. Will democratic countries really ever feel comfortable having the kind of close and thoroughgoing relationship with China that they've had historically with the United States? Can you ever have close and enduring relations with a country with such different values and such a different political system? And I think there's good reason to believe that the democracies of the world would never be able to have the kind of close relationship with an autocratic China that they've had with a country like the United States that shares their system and shares their values. Final question, and the most important, is international conflict. So theory says that in international conflict, democracies tend to do better. So I pointed out that one of the reasons is democracies are more likely to choose wars better, that they're less likely to choose wars they're going to lose. I forgot to mention a second reason. A second reason is that some scholars think that democracies might actually fight, or soldiers fight better on the battlefield. Because in democracies, we value individual initiative, entrepreneurship, individuality. And so therefore, in the heat of battle, democracies trust their soldiers and give lower-level commanders initiative on the battlefield. Let them make battlefield decisions, respond to real-time events. Whereas on the other hand, in autocratic systems, that kind of individuality and pushing power down to lower levels isn't valued, and in fact, it's seen as a problem. That higher-level political leaders don't like it when their subordinates are acting on their own. And so soldiers in autocracies are more likely to wait for orders. It's safer to wait for orders and do exactly as you're told. If you take initiative on the battlefield and it turns out your superiors don't like that, it could be dangerous. So democratic soldiers are actually more effective. Okay, so what does this mean for the military balance with the United States and China? Well, here too, China has increased its military power in recent years, but the gap is still very wide. The United States remains the only state with global power projection capabilities. The United States has alliances and forces in Europe and in Asia. China is still building a military for Asia. When we talk about possible conflict with the United States and China, we don't talk about conflict in Europe or in North America or anywhere. It's in East Asia. China is still very much a regional military power. It's not a global military power. And given how long it takes to invest in military technology, if China made the decision today that it wanted to be a global military power, that it wanted to invest in aircraft carriers and other things, it would take decades for it to get there. So the United States will remain the only global military power for decades to come. But that does raise important questions, especially for people in Asia, of who will be the leading military power in Asia. Even if China is only a regional power, it could be a very serious regional power in Asia, and I think that it is. But there are real questions about the effectiveness of the Chinese military. They're buying a lot of hardware, but how effective will they be at using that hardware in the battlefield if God forbid, a war broke out? So China hasn't fought a conflict since the 1970s. The United States, for better or worse, has a military that's more tested and battle-hardened. Second, I think we see some of these differences between democracies and autocracies in the military that theory would suggest. So the Chinese military, their officials still spend a lot of time doing indoctrination, Chinese Communist Party indoctrination. That's time that's taken away from training and other things that would improve battlefield effectiveness. And we still see that high-level Chinese authorities don't trust their military, don't trust their officers. And one good example of this is the nuclear force, something that my background is really in nuclear strategy. So the United States has nuclear-armed submarines. So we send submarines to sea armed with nuclear weapons. And the reason we do that is to have a so-called second strike capability. That even if Russia or China hit the US homeland with a massive nuclear attack and destroyed all of our nuclear weapons in the United States, we would still have these nuclear submarines at sea. They would be very hard to destroy, and so they could retaliate. And as long as Russia and China and North Korea know that we have those submarines, they'll be deterred from attacking in the first place because they know we have this second strike capability. So China has talked about developing nuclear-armed submarines for decades. In fact, they had their first one in port in 1986. So here we are, 3 decades later. To this date, China still isn't conducting nuclear deterrence patrols with its submarines. In part, we think because they don't trust their nuclear submarine commanders to have nuclear weapons at sea. So this is a very concrete manifestation about how these different kind of systems can impede not just battlefield effectiveness, but something as important as strategic nuclear deterrence on the country. So of course we all hope that the United States and China can work together peacefully, that we'll be able to avoid military conflict. But if, God forbid, it came to a military conflict over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, over the Senkakus, I think there's very good reason to believe that the United States, it would be a terrible war, but the United States would win decisively. So in sum, if we look at all these measures, economic growth, financial strength, international political strength, alliance strength, military strength, I think there's no question that the United States is, to this day, the leading state in the international system, and every reason to believe that it will remain the leading state in the international system for decades to come. So what does that mean? Coming back to our original question. Well, I think what it means is that Russia, China, ISIS, others, North Korea, are trying to challenge the system the United States and its allies have set up since 1945. But I think there's very good reason to believe that they will be unsuccessful. That just like Nazi Germany, just like the Soviet Union before them, that these systems don't lend themselves to international leadership. So I think either the Chinese system of government will have to fundamentally change, the Chinese Communist Party will have to give up political control and become a more democratic system, the kind of democratic system that can be a true international leader. Or if President Xi and the leaders in China want to cling on to this autocratic form of government, they can do that. They can retain power. But as long as they do that, China is always going to be a second-tier power, will never be a leading power in the international system. And I think here in Manila, what that means for U.S. partners is that there's very good reasons still for the United States and its partners to maintain our traditional alliances, to work together, to continue to further the type of system we've created over the past 70 years, and not to worry about the challenges others pose to our system and to our type of government. So I think I'll end my opening remarks there and very much look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.